The first time he saw the girl digging through the trash, he laughed out loud, cold, dismissive, and sharp. His daughter would have been the same age. No one could blame him for turning away. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your soul. Thomas Caldwell stood behind the bulletproof windows of his San Francisco penthouse, watching the fog roll across the bay like a shroud covering the city's secrets. At 62, he commanded a business empire worth over $3 billion. Tech investments, cryptocurrency portfolios, real estate ventures spanning from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. His portfolio included everything from Apple stocks to Bitcoin mining operations, generating millions in passive income daily. Yet for all his wealth, Thomas lived like a prisoner in his own glass tower. The mansion's corridors echoed with emptiness, each footstep a reminder of the silence that had consumed his life for 5 years. Mahogany shelves lined with first-edition books remained untouched, their leather bindings gathering dust like forgotten dreams. Crystal chandeliers cast cold light on marble floors that reflected nothing but loneliness. In the library, every clock had stopped at 3:15, the exact moment his world collapsed when his 8-year-old daughter Emily vanished without a trace from Golden Gate Park. Thomas had spent fortunes on private investigators, search teams, and psychics. His assets had funded missing children organizations across California, hoping that somewhere in the maze of leads and false hopes he might find her. But money, he discovered, couldn't buy back what mattered most. His wife Sarah had left 2 years after Emily's disappearance, unable to bear the weight of his obsessive grief. "You're not living, Thomas," she had whispered before walking out. "You're just existing in a museum of pain." Now Thomas moved through his days like a ghost. Board meetings blurred into investment calls, stock reports became white noise. His personal assistant managed his calendar with military precision, scheduling every minute to avoid the dangerous spaces where memories could creep in. The mansion's smart home system automated everything: lights that dimmed at sunset, classical music that played softly through hidden speakers, temperature controls that maintained a constant 72 degrees. It was a perfect environment for avoiding the unpredictable chaos of actual life. South of Market, in a neighborhood where street art bloomed on brick walls and the aroma of fresh tortillas mixed with exhaust fumes, 9-year-old Lila Martinez began each morning with the same ritual. She would kneel beside her narrow bed in their studio apartment, close her eyes, and whisper a prayer for everyone who had lost something precious. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts as a hospital cleaner, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, her hands raw from industrial soap and exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Their apartment building stood in stark contrast to Thomas's mansion. Peeling paint revealed layers of previous lives. Stairs creaked with the weight of countless footsteps, and thin walls couldn't contain the sounds of babies crying, televisions broadcasting Spanish soap operas, and families gathering around small tables for dinner. But within these modest walls lived something Thomas's billions couldn't purchase: hope that refused to die. Lila possessed an unusual gift for finding beauty in discarded things. She would explore the alleys behind upscale restaurants and boutiques, discovering treasures others overlooked: a silk scarf with a small tear, books with coffee stains on their covers, jewelry missing a stone or two. Her gentle hands would clean each item carefully, imagining the stories they carried. To her, everything deserved a second chance. On a foggy October morning, while searching through the dumpsters behind Thomas's mansion, Lila's fingers closed around something cold and metallic. She pulled out an ornate silver medallion, tarnished black with age, its chain broken and tangled with coffee grounds. Most people would have tossed it back, but Lila saw possibility in its intricate engravings. She cleaned it with the hem of her jacket, revealing delicate roses carved around the edges. When she pressed the tiny clasp, the medallion opened to reveal a faded photograph, a little girl with bright eyes and blonde curls, smiling at something beyond the camera's reach. The child wore a yellow sundress and clutched a stuffed elephant, her expression radiating the kind of pure joy that seemed impossible to extinguish. Lila studied the photo with growing recognition. She had seen this face before, printed on missing person flyers posted throughout the city, though the image had faded from public memory as years passed. Thomas discovered the intrusion when his security system alerted him to movement in the garden. Through the surveillance monitors, he watched a small figure in worn sneakers and an oversized sweater, carefully placing the medallion on his doorstep. The sight triggered something primal and protective, anger mixed with an emotion he couldn't quite name. His fortune had built walls specifically to prevent moments like this, unexpected encounters that might crack the careful shell he'd constructed around his heart. When Thomas emerged onto the marble steps, Lila looked up without fear. Her dark eyes held a depth that seemed impossible for someone so young, as if she carried wisdom inherited from generations of women who had learned to find light in darkness. She held out the medallion with steady hands, her voice soft but clear. "I thought you might want this back, sir. I found it with your garbage, but it feels too important to throw away." Thomas stared at Emily's photograph, and for a moment, the years collapsed into nothing. He remembered buying the medallion for his daughter's 7th birthday, watching her face light up when she opened the velvet box, listening to her promise to keep his picture close to her heart always. The day she disappeared, he had searched frantically through her room, wondering why she hadn't been wearing it. Now he knew. It had been lost in the chaos of their final morning together. What could a child possibly understand about loss? Thomas's voice emerged harsher than intended, defense mechanisms engaging automatically. He had learned that showing vulnerability invited pain, and pain was a luxury he could no longer afford. His wealth had purchased the finest therapists, the most exclusive grief counselors, but their expensive wisdom paled beside the simple presence of a 9-year-old girl holding his daughter's face in her small hands. But Lila didn't retreat. Her innocence served as armor against his coldness, and she recognized something familiar in his pain, the same desperate emptiness she had seen in her mother's eyes during their hardest times. "She's beautiful," Lila said quietly, studying Emily's photograph. "She has kind eyes. I bet she's waiting for you to remember how to smile again." Those words pierced through Thomas's defenses like sunlight through storm clouds. No therapist had ever spoken with such directness, such simple faith in healing. He found himself studying Lila's face, searching for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but saw only genuine compassion. Her worn clothes spoke of financial struggle, yet she radiated a wealth that his billions had never provided, the riches of an unbroken spirit. For the first time in years, Thomas invited someone into his mansion who wasn't a business associate or domestic staff. Lila stepped through the entrance with wonder, her eyes taking in the crystal chandeliers and marble sculptures with the appreciation of someone accustomed to beauty in small doses. The mansion's silence seemed less oppressive with her presence, as if her very breathing brought life back to spaces that had forgotten how to hold it. Lila moved through the rooms like a gentle breeze, her fingers trailing along silk curtains and mahogany banisters with reverent care. When she reached the library, she stopped before the collection of stopped clocks, her head tilted in that curious way children have when processing something adults have forgotten how to see. "Time got stuck here," she observed matter-of-factly, "but that doesn't mean it stopped everywhere else." Thomas watched her examination of his frozen world with growing fascination. Lila approached Emily's untouched bedroom with the solemnity of entering a cathedral, her respect for the sacred space evident in every careful step. She studied the books arranged on shelves, the stuffed animals positioned exactly as Emily had left them, the art supplies waiting for hands that would never return to use them. She loved purple, Lila noted, touching the corner of a crayon drawing taped to the wall, and horses and drawing clouds that looked like ice cream. Her observations were simple but accurate, details only another child would notice. Thomas realized he had been so focused on preserving Emily's room as a monument to loss that he had forgotten to celebrate what it revealed about her life. As autumn deepened into winter, Lila began visiting regularly. Her mother, Maria, worked long shifts at San Francisco General Hospital, leaving Lila with elderly neighbors who were kind but tired. The mansion offered Lila something her crowded apartment building couldn't: space to think, to dream, to imagine possibilities beyond immediate survival. Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations, her questions that cut straight to the heart of matters he had been avoiding for years. "Do you think she knows you miss her?" Lila asked one afternoon, settling into Emily's reading chair as naturally as if she belonged there. Thomas had been reviewing quarterly reports on his tablet, cryptocurrency values fluctuating in real time, but her question made the numbers seem suddenly meaningless. "I hope so," Thomas admitted, his voice rougher than usual. He had spent so much energy trying to control his grief that he had forgotten to simply feel it, to let the love underneath the pain breathe again. Lila's presence created a safe space for emotions he had locked away in the same way he protected his financial assets from market volatility. Lila would tell stories about her neighborhood, Mrs. Chen, who fed stray cats despite her landlord's complaints, the teenage boy who painted murals on abandoned buildings to cover gang graffiti, the community garden where volunteers grew vegetables for families who couldn't afford fresh produce. Her world was filled with small miracles that happened when people chose kindness over indifference, connection over isolation. "Mama says angels sometimes dress like regular people," Lila shared one evening as they sat in the mansion's vast dining room, her voice echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. "Maybe your daughter became one of those angels. Maybe she's working behind the scenes, trying to help you remember how to be happy again." Thomas had abandoned religious faith long before Emily's disappearance, viewing it as a luxury for people who hadn't experienced true loss. But Lila's gentle certainty began to chip away at his cynicism. She spoke of divine presence the way other children talked about favorite toys, with absolute trust and natural familiarity. Her prayers weren't desperate pleas, but conversations with a friend she knew was listening. The mansion began to change in subtle ways. Thomas found himself opening curtains to let natural light stream across marble floors. He started playing music, not the ambient soundtracks programmed by his smart home system, but the classical pieces Emily had loved, the Disney songs she had sung while coloring, the lullabies he used to hum during bedtime stories. The silence that had protected him from painful memories also prevented him from accessing joyful ones. Lila brought her own contributions to their friendship. She would arrive with drawings made on the back of old homework papers, pictures of flowers that looked like people, clouds shaped like animals, rainbows that connected earth to heaven. She shared books borrowed from the community center library, their pages soft from countless readings by children who had learned to find escape in stories. Her generosity was proportional not to her means, but to her heart. But Maria Martinez watched her daughter's growing attachment to the wealthy man with increasing concern. She had cleaned the houses of rich families for years, witnessing their casual cruelty and fundamental disconnection from people like her. Working double shifts left her exhausted and suspicious of anyone who showed interest in Lila, especially someone whose wealth could influence social services or change their lives in ways she couldn't control. "Rich people don't become friends with girls like you, mija," Maria warned one evening, her words careful but firm. She had seen too many stories that began with kindness and ended with disappointment. "They have their own world, their own rules. We're just entertainment until they get bored." But Lila couldn't explain how Thomas was different, how his sadness felt familiar rather than foreign, how his mansion full of beautiful things seemed lonelier than their small apartment full of love. She sensed something in him that recognized something in her. Two people who understood what it meant to carry more hope than circumstances seemed to warrant. The change that worried Maria was the light returning to Thomas's eyes. The way he began asking Lila about her dreams and actually listening to her answers. He started investing in her education in small ways: books about art and science, a better backpack for school, art supplies that weren't borrowed from community centers. His generosity felt natural rather than calculated, as if helping Lila was helping him remember how to participate in life again. Christmas arrived with unusual warmth for San Francisco, the fog lifting early each morning to reveal blue skies that seemed designed for new beginnings. Thomas found himself decorating the mansion for the first time since Emily's disappearance, not with professional designers, but with Lila's help, hanging ornaments that looked homemade rather than expensive, stringing lights that twinkled instead of glowed with architectural precision. On Christmas Eve, Dr. Harrison Webb arrived unannounced at Thomas's door. Harrison had been Emily's pediatrician and Thomas's friend since college, one of the few people who remembered Thomas before grief had hollowed him out. But Harrison's expression carried professional concern rather than holiday warmth. "Tom, we need to talk," Harrison said, declining the offered drink and settling heavily into a leather chair. "I've been hearing things around the medical community. Stories about you spending time with a young girl, giving her gifts, having her in Emily's room. People are concerned about your mental state." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire Thomas couldn't see. Harrison explained that well-meaning friends had contacted him, worried that Thomas was transferring his grief onto an inappropriate substitute, that his judgment had become compromised by loss and isolation. The medical community that had failed to heal his broken heart now questioned his ability to form healthy relationships. "She's just a child who showed kindness to a broken man," Thomas protested, but Harrison's skepticism was evident. The doctor saw pathology where Thomas had found healing, manipulation, where he had discovered genuine connection. Harrison recommended professional intervention, medications to manage what he termed displacement grief, and strict boundaries to prevent further episodes. That conversation planted seeds of doubt that grew through the winter weeks. Thomas began questioning his own perceptions, wondering if Lila's wisdom was projection rather than reality, if her healing presence was wishful thinking rather than genuine grace. The medical establishment that had failed to find Emily now diagnosed his attempt to heal as dangerous delusion. Maria received a visit from Child Protective Services after an anonymous report raised concerns about Lila's safety. The social worker was kind but thorough, questioning Lila about her friendship with Thomas, examining their apartment for signs of neglect or inappropriate influence. Maria's worst fears materialized. Their association with wealth had painted them as targets rather than beneficiaries. "He's a good man, Mama," Lila insisted after the social worker left. But Maria's protective instincts had been triggered. She had worked too hard to provide stability for her daughter to risk losing her to bureaucratic concerns about appropriate relationships between social classes. The system designed to protect children often penalized honest connections that crossed economic boundaries. Spring arrived with restrictions that felt like winter's return. Maria forbade Lila from visiting the mansion, and Thomas, shaken by professional warnings and social pressure, withdrew into the fortress his wealth had built. The brief season of healing was replaced by familiar isolation, as if the outside world had conspired to restore the profitable status quo of successful segregation. Thomas returned to his old patterns: board meetings that stretched through lunch, investment strategies that consumed weekends, charitable donations that provided tax benefits without personal involvement. His Bitcoin portfolio reached new heights. His real estate investments generated record returns, but the numbers felt hollow compared to Lila's drawings still hanging on his refrigerator. The mansion's silence returned with a vengeance. Clocks that had begun ticking again fell silent, curtains stayed closed against spring sunshine, and Emily's room became a mausoleum once more. Thomas told himself this was appropriate, that professional boundaries existed for good reasons, that a man of his position couldn't afford the luxury of surrogate relationships. But late at night, Thomas would find himself staring at Emily's medallion, remembering Lila's small hands placing it carefully in his palm, her certain words about second chances and angels in disguise. The medical community could diagnose his grief, but they couldn't explain the peace he had felt during those winter months when a 9-year-old girl had reminded him how to hope. On a foggy morning in April, exactly 6 months after Lila's first visit, Thomas discovered a small envelope slipped under his door. His name was written in careful cursive, the kind taught in elementary schools to children who still believed handwriting mattered. Inside, folded around Emily's medallion, was a note that would change the trajectory of his remaining years. The paper was lined notebook paper, slightly wrinkled from small hands that had gripped it tightly. Lila's words were simple but profound. "Mr. Thomas, I'm sorry we can't be friends anymore, but that doesn't make the friendship less real. Emily wants you to know she's okay, and she's proud of how you took care of me when Mama couldn't. Love doesn't end just because people have to go away. Thank you for remembering how to smile. Keep the medallion. She says you need it more than she does now. Love, Lila. P.S. Check the garden behind your house." Thomas read the note 3 times before its full impact registered. Then he walked through the mansion's corridors toward the back garden, his footsteps echoing differently than they had for months. The garden had been professionally maintained but unused, a perfect landscape that no one enjoyed. But near the fountain, he discovered evidence of Lila's final visit. She had planted a small garden using flowers that bloomed in Emily's favorite colors: purple pansies, yellow daffodils, white roses that would climb the trellis Thomas had installed years ago but never decorated. A small sign, handmade from cardboard and markers, read, "Emily's Garden, where love grows forever." It was the kind of memorial that celebrated life rather than mourning death. That garden became Thomas's turning point. He knelt in the soil that morning, his expensive suit collecting dirt stains that he ignored, and felt something shift inside his chest. The pain was still there, but it had transformed from a wound that wouldn't heal into a scar that told a story of survival. Lila's belief in love's permanence had given him permission to grieve without abandoning hope. The medallion felt different in his hands now, not a relic of loss, but a bridge between past and future. Emily's photograph smiled out from its silver frame, but Thomas could finally smile back without feeling he was betraying her memory. Love, he realized, wasn't diminished by death or distance, but purified by it. Stripped of everything except what truly mattered. Over the following months, Thomas began rebuilding his life around purpose rather than pain. He established the Emily Grace Foundation, dedicating significant portions of his wealth to supporting children who had experienced loss or trauma. But unlike his previous charitable donations, tax-efficient transfers designed to benefit causes at arm's length, this work required his personal involvement. He visited pediatric hospitals, not as a wealthy donor cutting ceremonial ribbons, but as a man who understood that healing happened through connection rather than just medical intervention. He funded art therapy programs, reading rooms in children's shelters, and community gardens in neighborhoods where beauty was often a luxury families couldn't afford. Thomas hired Maria as the foundation's community outreach coordinator, recognizing her insight into the needs of working families who fell through bureaucratic cracks. Their professional relationship allowed him to stay connected to Lila's world without violating the boundaries that protected her. Maria's initial skepticism softened as she witnessed Thomas's genuine commitment to helping rather than just giving. The mansion transformed from a monument to grief into a headquarters for healing. Conference rooms that had housed board meetings now welcomed support groups for parents of missing children. The library where clocks had stopped became a quiet space for counseling sessions. Emily's room remained unchanged, but it was no longer isolated. It became part of a home where children were welcomed rather than feared. Through the foundation's work, Thomas met dozens of children who carried wisdom beyond their years, youngsters who had learned to find hope in impossible circumstances. Each interaction reminded him of Lila's gift for seeing light in darkness, for believing in possibility when adults had surrendered to practicality. These children became his teachers, showing him how resilience could coexist with tenderness. 5 years after that spring morning when he found Lila's note, Thomas stood in Emily's garden watching the sunset paint the San Francisco Bay in shades of gold and purple. The flowers Lila had planted had multiplied into a riot of color that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds, creating life from what had been merely decorative space. The medallion remained on his desk, but its significance had evolved. Emily's photograph still smiled from its silver frame, but now it was surrounded by drawings from children the foundation had helped, thank you notes from families who had found stability through its programs, and photos from community events where laughter had replaced tears as the dominant sound. At 77, Thomas moved more slowly through the mansion's corridors, but his steps carried purpose that had been missing for too many years. His wealth continued to grow, investment portfolios managed by trusted advisors, cryptocurrency holdings that had appreciated beyond his wildest projections, real estate ventures that generated steady income streams. But money had returned to its proper place as a tool rather than a master, means for healing rather than hoarding. The clocks throughout the mansion ticked steadily now, marking time that moved forward rather than staying frozen in past trauma. The silence had been replaced by sounds of life, children's voices during foundation events, staff meetings planning new programs, and music that played because Thomas enjoyed it rather than as mere background ambiance. Dr. Harrison Webb visited regularly now, not as a concerned physician, but as a friend who had watched Thomas transform grief into grace. Harrison admitted his earlier concerns had been misguided, that the medical community's emphasis on protecting patients sometimes prevented the very connections that facilitated healing. Lila's influence on Thomas had been profound precisely because it was authentic rather than therapeutic. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit in the garden Lila had created, feeling Emily's presence in every flower that bloomed according to her favorite colors. He no longer questioned whether his daughter was watching from some distant realm. Lila had taught him that love transcended the boundaries mortality seemed to impose. Faith wasn't about proving supernatural intervention, but about trusting that connections formed in love never completely severed. The foundation had grown beyond Thomas's initial vision, spawning satellite programs in cities across California and inspiring similar efforts nationwide. Lila, now in high school and considering a career in social work, served on the foundation's youth advisory board, her insights helping shape programs for children who face circumstances similar to her own childhood experiences. Thomas's relationship with Lila had evolved appropriately over the years. He had become a mentor and family friend rather than a surrogate father, supporting her education and celebrating her achievements while respecting the boundaries that protected them both. Maria had become not just an employee, but a trusted colleague whose wisdom had shaped the foundation's approach to serving families with dignity rather than charity that carried hidden costs. The mansion's guest rooms, once empty monuments to isolation, now housed visiting families whose children received treatment at San Francisco hospitals. The foundation covered their expenses, but Thomas's greatest joy came from the sounds of daily life. Children arguing over television channels, parents sharing coffee in the kitchen, teenagers practicing music in rooms that had been silent for too long. Emily's bedroom remained a special place, but it was no longer untouchable. Children visiting the mansion were welcome to play there, to choose books from her shelves, to add their own artwork to walls that had displayed only memories. Thomas discovered that sharing Emily's space with other children honored her memory more meaningfully than preserving it as an untouched shrine. As twilight settled over San Francisco Bay, Thomas opened the medallion one more time, Emily's face smiling up at him from the faded photograph. The child in the picture would be 18 now if she were still alive, perhaps starting college or traveling or falling in love for the first time. Thomas had learned to grieve the milestones she would miss while celebrating the life she had lived, however brief. 18 years had passed since Emily's disappearance, and Thomas found himself thinking more frequently about parallel lives, the path he had walked and the one he might have taken if circumstances had been different. The foundation's success had brought him recognition and purpose, but more importantly, it had taught him that healing wasn't a destination, but a continuous journey of choosing connection over isolation. Maria had become one of his closest friends, their initial wariness transformed into mutual respect and shared mission. She understood better than anyone how Thomas had changed from the bitter man who first encountered her daughter. Their weekly meetings felt more like conversations between old friends than professional discussions, though they never lost sight of the serious work that bound them together. The Foundation's most recent project had been Thomas's idea, a summer camp for children who had lost siblings. He remembered the loneliness that followed Emily's disappearance, how being an only child had made him feel responsible for carrying his parents' entire hopes and dreams. These children understood that particular weight, the pressure of being the surviving child in families that had been fundamentally altered by loss. Camp Sunshine, as the children had named it, operated on the Foundation's property in Sonoma County. 160 acres of rolling hills, redwood groves, and meadows where wildflowers grew in abundance. Thomas had purchased the land 5 years earlier, initially intending it as a retreat center for adults. But watching children explore its natural beauty had convinced him that young people needed this space more than their parents did. Lila, now 24 and completing her master's degree in social work, served as the camp's assistant director. Her childhood gift for finding beauty in broken things had evolved into professional expertise in helping traumatized children rebuild their sense of safety and possibility. Thomas watched her work with pride and amazement, seeing how the scared 9-year-old who had returned his daughter's medallion had grown into a healer whose influence would ripple through countless lives. The cabins at Camp Sunshine were designed to feel like homes rather than institutional buildings. Each housed 6 children and 2 counselors, creating small family units where kids could experience stability and belonging. The dining hall buzzed with conversations in multiple languages: English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Russian, reflecting the diverse communities the Foundation served throughout California. Thomas loved visiting the camp during its summer sessions, not as the wealthy benefactor but as an honorary grandfather figure who helped with activities, listened to stories, and shared his own experiences with loss and recovery. The children knew he had lost a daughter, but they also saw how he had transformed that grief into something that helped others. His presence gave them permission to believe their own pain could become purposeful. One evening during the camp's final session of the year, Thomas sat around a campfire listening to the children share their favorite memories from the week. A 12-year-old girl named Sophia, whose baby brother had died from cancer, spoke about learning to trust again. A teenage boy named Marcus, still grieving his twin sister's death in a car accident, talked about feeling less alone with his survivor's guilt. Their words carried echoes of conversations Thomas had shared with Lila 15 years earlier, reminders that healing followed similar patterns regardless of the specifics of loss. These children possessed the same remarkable resilience that had drawn him to Lila, the same ability to find hope in circumstances that had defeated many adults. They were his teachers now, showing him daily how human beings could endure the unthinkable and still choose kindness. As the camp session ended and families arrived to pick up their children, Thomas watched reunions that carried new depth and understanding. Parents who had sent withdrawn, angry children to camp were greeting kids who laughed more easily, spoke more openly about their feelings, and seemed less afraid of forming new relationships. The transformation wasn't complete. Grief didn't disappear in a week, but it was significant enough to provide foundation for continued healing. Dr. Harrison Webb had become the Foundation's chief medical advisor, overseeing partnerships with children's hospitals throughout the region. His initial skepticism about Thomas's unconventional approach to healing had evolved into enthusiastic advocacy for programs that combined medical intervention with emotional and spiritual support. He often told colleagues that Thomas had taught him more about treating traumatized children than his medical training had provided. The Foundation's headquarters buzzed with activity year-round now. The mansion's formal dining room had become a conference center where researchers presented findings about childhood trauma recovery. The ballroom hosted fundraising events that raised millions for expanding programs. The conservatory had been converted into a playroom where children waiting for counseling appointments could find distractions and comfort. Thomas's personal quarters remained simple despite the mansion's transformation into a bustling nonprofit center. His bedroom, study, and private sitting room maintained the quiet elegance they had possessed during his years of isolation, but now they served as refuge rather than prison. He needed spaces where he could retreat from the constant activity, where he could process the stories he heard and the pain he witnessed daily. Emily's room had undergone the most significant transformation. While it retained her furniture and some personal items, it had become a memorial library where children could read, draw, or simply sit quietly when they needed solitude. The walls displayed artwork created by hundreds of children who had found healing through the Foundation's programs, creating a gallery of resilience that honored Emily's memory while celebrating the ongoing triumph of hope over despair. The medallion occupied a place of honor in this room, displayed in a small case alongside a book where visitors could write messages to loved ones they had lost. Children often spent time there, adding their own notes to family members, friends, or pets who had died. Thomas read these messages regularly, drawing strength from their honest expressions of love and longing. On his 80th birthday, the Foundation organized a celebration that brought together hundreds of families whose lives had been touched by its programs. The mansion's grounds filled with children playing games, teenagers sharing music, parents connecting with others who understood their journeys. Thomas moved through the crowd with genuine joy, his earlier fears about social interaction replaced by appreciation for authentic human connection. Lila delivered the evening's keynote address, speaking about how a chance encounter with a grieving man had shaped her understanding of healing and purpose. She described Thomas not as a wealthy philanthropist, but as someone who had taught her that true generosity came from sharing one's authentic self rather than just financial resources. Her words brought tears to many eyes, including Thomas's own. 15 years ago, I was a little girl who believed everything deserved a second chance, Lila told the gathered crowd. I found a broken piece of jewelry in the trash and thought it was too beautiful to throw away. What I discovered was that sometimes when we return what seems lost to its rightful owner, we receive something even more valuable in return. The knowledge that healing is always possible, that love really does conquer death, and that the smallest acts of kindness can transform entire lives. Maria spoke next, sharing her perspective as a single mother who had initially feared the wealthy man showing interest in her daughter. She described watching Thomas evolve from someone who hoarded his pain to someone who transformed it into healing for others. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed profound change firsthand, who could testify to the reality of redemption and growth. The evening concluded with a memorial service for Emily and all the children who had been lost too young. Thomas lit candles for each child represented in the gathering, speaking their names aloud and acknowledging the ways their brief lives had created ripples of love that continued to expand. The ceremony wasn't mournful, but celebratory, recognizing that death's power to create meaning often exceeded its ability to destroy it. As guests departed and the mansion returned to quiet, Thomas sat in Emily's garden one more time. The flowers Lila had planted 20 years earlier had spread throughout the grounds, creating a living memorial that changed with each season but never lost its essential beauty. Butterflies danced among the blooms in the moonlight, their delicate movements suggesting the presence of spirits that remained close despite their physical absence. Thomas opened the medallion, Emily's face still smiling from its faded photograph. She would have been 28 now, possibly married, perhaps blessed with children of her own. He no longer tortured himself with such speculation, but allowed himself to imagine her pride in what her death had ultimately made possible. The Foundation had helped thousands of families navigate losses similar to his own, creating meaning from tragedy in ways that transformed grief into grace. The next morning brought news that would challenge everything Thomas thought he understood about his daughter's disappearance. Detective Sarah Chen, who had worked Emily's case for 2 decades, called to request an urgent meeting. Her voice carried unusual excitement, the tone of someone who had discovered something significant after years of following dead ends. Thomas met Detective Chen at the Foundation's headquarters, choosing the conference room where he felt most comfortable discussing difficult subjects. Chen spread photographs and documents across the polished table, her hands shaking slightly with anticipation. The case file had grown thick over the years, filled with false leads and frustrated investigations, but Chen had never stopped believing that answers existed somewhere in the maze of evidence. "Thomas, we found her," Chen said quietly, her words landing like stones in still water. "Emily is alive. She's been living in Portland under a different name, believing herself to be an orphan who was adopted as a toddler. Her adoptive parents recently died, and when she was going through their papers, she found documents that led her to contact us." The room spun around Thomas as Chen's words registered. Emily was alive. 20 years of grief, of learning to live with permanent loss, of building meaning from tragedy, all of it suddenly called into question by the impossible possibility that his daughter had survived. The foundation, the healing, the relationships he had built, none of it had been built on the foundation he thought he understood. Chen explained that Emily's adoptive parents had purchased her from human traffickers who had abducted her from Golden Gate Park. The couple had been unable to have children and had turned to illegal adoption when legitimate channels failed them. They had raised Emily with love and care, never realizing the pain their joy had caused her biological family. When they died in a car accident 6 months earlier, Emily had discovered the truth about her origins. "She wants to meet you," Chen continued, producing a recent photograph. The woman in the picture carried Emily's eyes and smile, but had grown into someone Thomas didn't recognize. 20 years had transformed his 8-year-old daughter into an adult with her own life, career, and relationships. She worked as a pediatric nurse in Portland, had been married and divorced, and was currently engaged to a teacher she had met through volunteer work with homeless children. Thomas stared at the photograph, his mind struggling to reconcile the adult face with his memories of a child frozen in time. This was Emily, but it was also a stranger, someone who had lived an entire life beyond his knowledge or influence. The reunion he had dreamed of for 2 decades was now possible, but it would unite 2 people who no longer knew each other. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a neutral location, a hotel conference room in Sacramento, halfway between their current lives. Thomas spent those 7 days in a state of emotional suspension, unable to fully process the magnitude of what was about to happen. The Foundation's staff rallied around him, understanding that this development would require significant adjustment for everyone involved. Lila flew in from her graduate program to provide support during the reunion. She understood better than anyone how Thomas's identity had been shaped by his role as Emily's grieving father. The Foundation existed because of Emily's disappearance. Thomas's relationship with her own family had grown from that tragedy. This miracle of return would necessarily disrupt the life Thomas had built from Emily's absence. When Thomas first saw Emily walking into the conference room, his heart recognized her immediately, despite 20 years of change. She moved with the same quiet grace she had possessed as a child, and her eyes still held the kindness that had drawn people to her. But she was also completely herself, an adult woman who had lived experiences he couldn't share or understand, who had formed relationships and made decisions independent of his influence. Their initial conversation was awkward, filled with the self-consciousness of strangers trying to bridge an impossible gap. Emily had no memories of her life before the adoption. Trauma and time had erased most recollections of her first 8 years. Thomas found himself describing events and people that meant nothing to her, sharing stories of a childhood she couldn't remember living. But underneath the awkwardness, love persisted. Emily had inherited Thomas's eyes and his mother's smile, genetic gifts that created immediate recognition despite their status as strangers. She spoke with warmth about her adoptive parents, describing a childhood filled with music lessons, family vacations, and the security of being cherished. Thomas felt simultaneous gratitude and grief. Thankful Emily had been loved, but mourning the relationship that had been stolen from both of them. Emily was amazed to learn about the foundation and the work Thomas had accomplished in her name. She walked through the mansion with wonder, seeing how her disappearance had been transformed into something that helped thousands of other families. The memorial library created from her childhood bedroom moved her to tears, not because she remembered the space, but because she could see how her absence had been honored and transformed into purpose. "I don't remember being your daughter," Emily told Thomas during one of their long conversations, "but I can see how losing me made you into someone who helps other people survive similar losses. I'm proud of that, even if I can't remember the little girl whose death inspired it." Thomas realized that Emily's return didn't erase the 20 years they had lost, but added a new chapter to a story he thought was finished. The foundation would continue its work because the need for healing persisted regardless of his personal resolution. The relationships he had built, the lives that had been changed, the meaning that had been created, all of it remained valid and important. Emily expressed interest in becoming involved with the foundation's work, though she needed time to process her own complex relationship with its existence. She had built a life in Portland that she loved and couldn't simply abandon, but she wanted to contribute to programs that helped children who had experienced trauma similar to her own, even if she couldn't remember experiencing it herself. The reunion made national news, generating renewed interest in missing children's cases and raising awareness about human trafficking. Thomas found himself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as reporters sought to understand how Emily's return affected both the grieving father and the foundation built around her absence. He struggled with interviews that wanted to frame the story as simple happiness, as if Emily's return erased 2 decades of complex grief and growth. Lila provided crucial support during this period, helping Thomas navigate the media attention while protecting the foundation's mission and the privacy of families it served. She had grown into a woman of remarkable wisdom and strength, able to see how Emily's return both complicated and enriched the work they had been doing together. "This doesn't make the foundation less important," Lila reminded Thomas during one of his moments of doubt about continuing their work. "Emily is one child who was found, but thousands of others are still lost. The healing you've experienced and facilitated doesn't become meaningless because the original tragedy had a different ending than we thought." Emily and Lila developed their own friendship, bonded by their shared love for Thomas and their professional commitments to helping vulnerable children. Emily's training as a pediatric nurse complemented Lila's social work expertise, creating possibilities for new programs that addressed both medical and emotional aspects of childhood trauma recovery. As Thomas approached his 85th birthday, he found himself reflecting on the unexpected turns his life had taken. Emily's return had been miraculous but complicated, requiring him to rebuild relationships while maintaining the work that had grown from her absence. The foundation had expanded its scope to include programs for families reunited after long separations, recognizing that recovery and return came with their own challenges and opportunities. The mansion served multiple functions now: foundation headquarters, reunion site for Emily's regular visits, and home for Thomas's extended chosen family. Maria lived in one of the guest wings, semi-retired but still involved in program planning. Lila visited regularly when her work schedule permitted. Emily came monthly, building relationship with the father she didn't remember, but learning to love through their shared commitment to helping others. Emily's room had been restored to reflect both her childhood and her adult presence. Some of her original toys and books remained, But the space now also contained photographs from her life in Portland, mementos from her adoptive family, and professional awards recognizing her nursing work. It had become a bridge between past and present, loss and return, memory and hope. Thomas kept the medallion on his desk, but its meaning had evolved again. Emily's photograph still smiled from its silver frame, but now it was surrounded by pictures of the adult daughter she had become, the families the foundation had helped, and the community of healers who had grown from their shared commitment to transforming pain into purpose. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit in the garden where Lila had planted Emily's memorial flowers 25 years earlier. The blooms continued to return each spring, reliable reminders that beauty could emerge from the darkest soil. The garden had become a place of meditation and gratitude, where Thomas could process the complex emotions that came with having his greatest loss transformed into his most profound gift. Emily's return had taught him that healing wasn't about achieving perfect closure, but about remaining open to mystery and possibility. The foundation would continue its work because suffering persisted regardless of individual resolution. But knowing Emily was alive and thriving added new dimension to everything they accomplished, proof that hope sometimes manifested in ways beyond imagination. The medallion remained Thomas's most treasured possession, but its significance had deepened rather than diminished with Emily's return. It represented not just love that survived death, but love that transcended all boundaries, time, distance, memory, and even the apparent finality of loss. It was a symbol of the eternal nature of bonds formed in authentic love, connections that persisted through every circumstance life could devise to test them. As Thomas prepared for sleep each night in the mansion that had been transformed from a monument to grief into a headquarters for healing, he would whisper the same prayer Lila had taught him decades earlier: gratitude for everyone who had lost something precious, and faith that love would find a way to bridge every gap that seemed impossible to cross. And you? Have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Someone whose simple faith reminded you that miracles often wear ordinary clothes and speak in quiet voices? Someone who taught you that healing comes not from eliminating pain, but from transforming it into purpose? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another soul that also needs to believe again. Sometimes the healing we desperately seek comes not from people our own size, but from hearts pure enough to see what we have forgotten exists. Sometimes the greatest miracles are the small hands that return what we thought was lost forever, reminding us that love never truly dies. It simply changes form, waiting patiently for the moment when we remember how to recognize it again.